a very warm welcome to Bright Blue's fifth Fringe event of this year's virtual Conservative Party conference. If you haven't come across us before, Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. Our research focuses on domestic, social, educational, environmental and economic policy, and actually we'll be having a major relaunch later this autumn, so do keep an eye out for that. We have also launched today a new magazine examining the impact of COVID-19 on our family and social lives, and that includes an interview with the Treasury Minister, Jezeph MP. It's available online to have a look at, so check out brightblue.org.uk to have a view of that. My name is Alexandra. I'm the Non-Exec Director and member of the board at Bright Blue. I should also disclose in my day job, I'm a Senior Development Manager at Transport for London, charged with the delivery of 1,700 new homes in central London. Our topic for the next hour is cheaper and greener, warming Britain's homes, and we're delighted to be partnering with Offtech for this debate, the trade organisation for the heating and cooking industries in the UK and Ireland. And we're live tweeting the event, so if you are on Twitter, please do use #BrightBlue and #CPC20, and you can also follow us on @WeAreBrightBlue and @Offtech. And of course, do submit your questions as we go. We'll take as many as we can. In 2019, the UK committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Achieving this target will require action from all sectors of the UK economy responsible for those emissions, and this includes the housing sector, which is currently responsible for around 14% of UK emissions. Conservative governments have announced a range of initiatives over the past few years to make progress on this agenda. As an example, the Clean Growth Strategy in 2017 sets, amongst other objectives, the requirement to upgrade as many homes as possible to the Energy Performance Certificate Band C for a deadline of 2035. Other retrofitting policy initiatives include the Energy Company Obligation, and that directs support to fuel-poor customers, and the Green Deal, which supports retrofit works via loans. Just last week, the government announced the Green Homes Grant to support homeowners and residential landlords with the cost of improvements to reduce energy or install low-carbon heating solutions. But is this enough? And for these schemes that we already have, are they actually proving effective? So today we're asking our panelists to explore some key questions, including, are consumer energy bills in the UK too high? How do we create a successful market for low carbon and energy efficient products? Why have past energy efficiency schemes failed? And what can be done in the future to prevent this from happening again? And how can off-grid households, especially those in rural areas, be best supported to transition to low-carbon heating? So to debate these important questions, we're delighted to be joined by 5 expert speakers. We have Bob Blackman MP here, who is member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee and has served as MP for Harrow East since 2010. We have Malcolm Farrow, who is Head of Communications at Offtech. Emma Gatten is Environment Editor at the Telegraph, and we have Adam Scorer, who is Chief Executive of National Energy Action, and Guy Newey, who is Strategy and Performance Director at Energy Systems Catapult. So I will ask everyone to speak in the order that I've mentioned, so hopefully they caught that. Thank you to all our speakers for joining us. I believe we've got 5 minutes each, and I'll invite Bob Blackman to open the discussion. Bob.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you for that kind introduction. As you quite rightly say, I've served not only as an MP for the last 10.5 years and also the whole time on the HCLG Select Committee, but before that I was a councillor in London Borough of Brent for 24 years and also served time on the London Assembly. In all that time, I've concentrated on housing and regeneration aspects of trying to improve the quality of the environment, both the home environment and the resultant impact. I think actually we've got 3 potential challenges. The first is rather easier to deal with than the other 2. The first challenge is to make sure that new homes that we build are energy efficient, and conform to everything we would like to see, encouraging the use of various different means of heating and lighting, but making sure they are fit for purpose, designed for purpose, and allowed in the right sort of way. And that actually means that the government, I think, have got to incorporate that in the proposed planning changes that are taking place. But we're not going to concentrate on those too much today, I don't think. Then you've got the recently built developments, which hopefully would have allowed themselves to be able to be at least upgraded very quickly if they weren't built with energy efficiency in mind. And the third aspect is the retrofitting of existing housing that may have been built, up to 100 years ago. That is very much more difficult often to make energy efficient. And clearly it depends if they are combinations of flats, semi-detached houses, terrace houses, or even detached houses. All of those have different requirements and different levels of capability to be suitably upgraded. I think the other challenge we face, and we have to face up to this, and we're talking virtually, a virtual conference for the first time ever, and of course under this pandemic we've learnt that virtual meetings using technology is perfectly viable. And I contend that not only do people been forced to work from home often over the last 6 months, but actually more people will work from home more often than hitherto was the case. That means that homes have got to be designed not just to be energy efficient, but designed in such a way that people can work from home if they so wish. It also means that energy costs could rise dramatically if we don't actually take action to ensure that we have heating and lighting and efficient homes retaining the heat and light. We've also got to make sure that in our energy supply, what we provide is, as you say, low carbon energy, but it means that we have to harness the capability of offshore wind in particular, wind farms where appropriate, using the heat in the earth literally to deliver, and also potentially localized heating arrangements, particularly on housing estates which are created from new. So all these capabilities I think are critically important. I think actually the energy pricing model, I remember I worked on the original energy pricing model way back when we privatized the various different utilities, and that's horrendously complicated. I think possibly that's something that would need to be reviewed in the future as we go forward, because it does encourage a certain type of power generation. I'm not sure if we want to get into that, but that's another subject. Equally, domestic homes, I think for most people, the potential for upgrading their homes and making them energy efficient, where the homes have existed for quite some time, is potentially very expensive. So I welcome, obviously, the decision by the government to increase the grants available to enable people to retrofit. My concern is how well we can do that. Is the industry ready to actually deliver that in a meaningful way? So I think there are a series of challenges coming forward on this. I also think we have to diversify the supply of energy in the right sort of way, encouraging new nuclear as well as the renewable energy type, and reducing dramatically our reliance on fossil fuels, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere near the carbon neutral targets that we've set and wish to achieve. I also think, finally, because I know other speakers want to speak, actually communicating out to householders what they can do and how they can do it, I think is vitally important. And possibly when we've got blocks of flats and similar type of operation, where common hold hopefully will take hold in such a way, people will be enabled to decide for themselves to implement energy efficiency throughout their block of flats, rather than depending on a freeholder doing it for them and doing it to them, and potentially charging them a substantial amount of money for doing the job. I think people who've got the capability to make their own decisions are more likely to make good decisions which are viable and they can afford. But I'll stop there, Alex, and then hopefully take some questions as we go along.
Lovely, thank you for that. Sort of kicking us off there, Bob. I think there's some real themes there that we'll try and bring out later in the conversation, but certainly consumer communication, the costs, the concern around how we really can do this, and the diversity of the fuel sources. There's a range of points there. Malcolm, would you like to take up the stage next?
Yeah, great, thank you. So for those of you, first of all, who don't know much about Optech, we're a trade association representing manufacturers working in the liquid fuel sector. So heating oil is our main fuel of choice. We've got manufacturers of various sorts, and we've also got a network of about 90 training centres, because part of our work is to ensure that the technicians who work in people's homes are competent, and so we run a competent person scheme with roughly about 10,000 technicians registered with us at the moment. So we're very much concerned with the kind of how, if you like, how heating is installed and maintained in people's homes, and we're very interested in the kinds of technologies that are going to be used both now and in the future. I think the title of this event, Cheaper and Greener, really does identify the sort of two key challenges, really. The first one, of course, is to reduce our carbon emissions and make our homes more environmentally friendly, but also to do it at a price that people can afford. And I think that's a really tough challenge. And so far, it's been quite an elusive one, I think. Heat decarbonisation is identified as really one of the toughest challenges that we currently face. And I think it's probably fair to say that at the moment, insufficient progress has really been made up to now. BEIS, the government department mainly responsible for this, are to hold a major consultation later this year. And I think this makes this a really key moment for what's going to happen next. We've had 6 years of support through schemes like the RHI, but it's fair to say, particularly in areas where Optech is concerned, which are the rural homes, very little progress has been made. Only 1% of homes that are currently heated by oil have embraced low carbon technologies through the RHI. So clearly we need to have a bit of a rethink now about what kind of approaches we take to encourage people to embrace low carbon heating. And I think that's really something that needs to be rethought. And I think really the key is that we need to deliver these solutions at a price that people can afford, and at the same time make their homes more energy efficient, healthier, and above all more comfortable to live in. Because if they're paying a lot of money to decarbonise their heating and it doesn't actually make much difference to their quality of life, they're not going to embrace it. So we've really got to think about how we can do this affordably and in a way that has as little disruption as possible to people. I think that's really all I want to say about this. Really, but I think flexibility and choice is going to be key. The UK Climate Assembly has recently published its findings, and they really focused on things like minimising disruption, putting in place support around costs, and making it as the transition as easy as possible. And I think that's really what we need to think about. Really, one size does not fit all.
Malcolm, thanks very much there, giving us a bit of an overview on the how. Again, I think affordability, quality of life, and how we transition to a low carbon environment is sort of a few key things to draw out there. Emma, would you like to comment next?
Thanks. I thought it would be useful for me to talk a bit about, what people's views are of their home heating and how that fits with the green goals, from what I've experienced with talking to people. And I think that, we know that people basically don't want to have to think about their energy provision. They want to just kind of have their heating on, have their lighting on, and not really think beyond that. And I think when it comes to, net zero, changing your boiler isn't as exciting as buying a new electric car or something like that. So it's something people don't think about until they have to, and they then want the simplest and the least intrusive and the cheapest solution. We also know that people are less willing to spend more on their energy and electricity bills in order to become greener than they are on other things, and that's from Bright Blue's own polling recently. So I think that there is a bit of a mountain to climb in terms of public perception. And I think that is made harder by a bit of a lack of trust in new technology and in consumer protection. And that's based on things like previous experience of things like, the smart meter rollout and other insulation schemes. There are still kind of thousands of people who are dealing with poor insulation from previous subsidised schemes. And Malcolm mentioned the Climate Assembly, and one thing I noticed from their results was that things people thought were really important, were about having consumer protection and changes to kind of product standards to make sure that what they were buying, these major investments that they're making, people want to know that they can trust that they're making the right decision. And I think people are keen to get this done once it comes to it. If you can tell that, because there's huge interest in the Green Homes Grant. One estimate's put it 10 times the actual supply. And I do think that's going to be a really important test in gaining consumer trust. It's obviously literally very early days, so we're not seeing any problems. And there is this new trust mark that the government has put in place. But there have also been kind of concerns raised about the time frame. So all that work has got to be done by March, which, has led people to worry that it's going to be kind of dodgy rush jobs. And I think one of the other big risks is that we might see people, falling through the cracks. And there's a risk there of creating a sense of injustice around this transition. As an example, there are something like, I think, 49,000 people who are not on the gas grid, who still rely on coal as their primary heating. And thousands of those people are in fuel poverty. And then I think and most of those are in rural areas, obviously. And I think that it wasn't clear, for instance, when the government brought in this ban on wood and coal burning stoves, that those people had been kind of properly accounted for. And that policy was obviously more about air pollution, but I think it just kind of shows that we really have to make sure that everyone has an option, and everyone knows what their options are. I think just generally I would say that home heating is very low on people's green agendas. People are thinking about, switching their car, cutting down their meat, or they're flying. They're thinking about recycling. They're not really thinking so much about changing their boiler. And there's a risk there, I think, that it then becomes a rather expensive surprise to them. We've seen nearly 2 million homes since 2007 that are going to require retrofitting. And I think most of these have been built after the Climate Change Act came in. People, we knew that this was going to have to be done. And I think you can imagine that if you had bought one of these homes, you would have assumed that it was pretty much fit for the future. And you might be pretty frustrated to find out that kind of nobody had made sure that it was. And I think that part of this is that people aren't thinking about this because it's not clear in what direction they should be thinking. There's no, there is a lack of kind of government guidance about which way things are going to go. So, obviously that means we are kind of waiting for the things like the long anticipated energy white paper. So those, I think are just I want to raise about some of the kind of risks and where people are thinking on this.
Emma, thanks very much for your comments there on sort of the overall picture of government direction and guidance, as you say. And I'll pick up your mention of the Bright Blue polling as well. So that was Going Greener, Public Attitudes to Net Zero by Anvar Saragulov at Bright Blue. So it's available online if you'd like to look at that. Adam Scorer.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Offtech and Bright Blue for the invitation. Like everyone, I'm really delighted that we're talking about greener and cheaper, but I'm really delighted that you got warmer homes in the title of this session as well, because I think we've so often fail to remember some of the real benefits of making homes more efficient, which is that a good home is a prerequisite for a good life. And we have too many bad homes in the UK, which are unsafe, unhealthy, cold, damp, which means that people are less productive, less well, less sociable. So it's a really important kind of a point to remember that it's not just about tons of carbon abated and about size of bills reduced. It's about good homes for everybody. And for me, from NEA, for those who don't know, National Energy Action is a fuel poverty charity. So our concern is for those on the lowest incomes and in the least efficient homes, that we have these twin urgent imperatives: the 2050 drive towards net zero and the every winter drive towards making sure that people get out of cold and dangerous homes. The great thing for me and this debate is that in many ways, the drive to eradicate fuel poverty is enabled to an extent that it has never been enabled before by the drive towards net zero. But really sadly, it's been supercharged by the experience of COVID. So this drive to make sure that the decisive, sustainable answer to people living in cold homes is aligned to the drive towards decarbonising heat and taking that carbon stress that comes out of our domestic homes. But it's really important, I think, to remember that even though they're aligned, they're not the same, and they can be easily detached, especially at the pace and the targets that we might have to drive decarbonisation and net zero. So I just want to pick up on three of the many, what I think are the preconditions for making this programme work. The first is that even though we are reliant on 21st century technologies to achieve net zero and the decarbonisation of heat in domestic homes, we could probably do with a bit of 15th century philosophy as well. So for NEA, it's quite easy to have this Copernican view of the universe, where the household, both the property and the soft, fleshy human beings that inhabit it, are the centre of our universe. I think we have a risk with some of the technological factionalism that inevitably exists about, is it district heat, or is it electrification, is it green gas, is it hydrogen, what's going to play the decisive role? And I think that does sometimes divert ourselves from the fundamental task, is that we have a very heterogeneous housing stock, some of it appalling, and very heterogeneous human beings living with them. And unless you have solutions which address their needs, you'll just have an arms race, robot wars of trying to find out which tech is the most likely to succeed. And that really doesn't lead you very much at all. And it repeats the problem of exacerbating consumer confusion about trying to navigate that tech landscape. So, a focus on the households as consumers, as human beings, and as different property types. Been mentioned a couple of times already, but one of the critical crucibles for that is in the rural-urban distinction. The fact of life is that for too many people living in rural circumstances, their prices are too high because the fuel they use, they don't even have access to the market innovations of dual fuel. They may not have access to the internet and all the opportunities that has to reduce to get the best prices. Costs are often higher. Solid wall homes, difficult to heat, less access to low tech solutions, often cut out of most of the government programs, and they have a series of other inhibitors as well. The levels of support and advice aren't available. They've got excess, not only housing costs, but transport costs. So support services and the consumer protection in some of these markets are poor. So we just need to have a solution that works for those people who are off-grid or not benefiting from the mainstream consumer benefits of energy markets. And the last precondition is a lot's been said about green home grants. And I'm a huge enthusiast for green homes grants. I pull back from being an evangelist a little bit because it's just one part of the solution. It's an economic stimulus package, which is time limited, expects consumers to do an awful lot of work. What I hope we get back to is learn the lessons from the green home grants. I pray to God it works, and it works for those people engaged with it. I think in most parts it will, but we've got to get back to those great promises that we had in the Conservative manifesto that got derailed by COVID and putting off budgets and the comprehensive spending review. We need a strategic government-led intervention into the homes of the worst homes in the UK. Because even though I'm not for technological factionalism, I'm for one aspect of it, which is energy efficiency, to reduce the amount of space heating that we need to do. And that's got to face the fact that for so many people, the idea of capital investment and payback periods of that investment is just a foreign language. And for many, it's a foreign language with an alien alphabet and no phonetics and no pronunciation either. You've got to talk about the grants that are going to enable those on the lowest incomes in the least efficient homes to get their homes back up to standard in order that we can save on the £1.52 billion it costs the NHS but they can be more productive. Their kids' educational achievement can be greater. They're less lonely. They're less miserable. They're less stuck at home. So it's greener and it's cheaper, but it's the benefits of having good homes, good, warm, healthy, safe homes for everybody, and all the systems benefits that UK PLC gets from it.
Adam, thanks very much for that. A very passionate summary there of your preconditions. We'll now move on to Guy as our final speaker before we open up to a bit of a Q&A session.
Thanks, Alex. It's worth just reminding ourselves of how significant this challenge is. So you've got, 26 million homes that you're going to need to switch onto low carbon over the next 30 years. And at the moment, we're doing kind of less than 50,000 homes a year. And we're going to have to do that kind of number in a week when we're getting up to our peak. And that's an extraordinary challenge, but not overwhelming. And if you want to move that quick, and this follows on from some of the points that some of the other speakers have been making, you need low carbon heating that is as good or ideally better than what we have. So when you say cheaper and greener, I'm not sure that's enough for heating. It has to be better, and cheapness is part of that. And just to underline how difficult this is and how far you've got to take people on a journey. We did some research recently which found that you ask people who are committed to environmental action and get quite high numbers on need for activity, but around 47% of them don't realise that their gas boiler or their heating system is contributing to climate change. Now you've got to think of the journey you've got to get them on. You've got them to realise that of the pollution that the kind of normal heating system, which they often associate with clean, has got to get through, and then you've got to get them to shift to something different. So how do you get to this stage where something is better? And it's worth stressing, and it came out in some of the comments, both from Emma, but I think Bob hinted at this as well, that some people's heating experience at the moment isn't brilliant, right? There's lots, drafts are very common. People struggle to get their houses to the right temperature. There's obviously fuel poverty, which is struggled. We've struggled to move the dial on it. Overheating is a problem, even in winter in some houses. So you've got something that could be more desirable and could be better. So how do you go about fix that? Well, you've got to get the market signals right. You've got to make it worthwhile for people with low carbon heating solutions to come up with something better. And right now it's not. We load all the costs in a way that benefits the kind of fossil fuel side, which means you'll always be fighting against it. You need subsidy. We need people with a completely different set of skills if we're going to transform people to low carbon. That's why the work of Offtech and others is so important. You're going to need tens of thousands of people who can do your kind of retrofit in a coordinated way. At the moment, if you want to switch to a low carbon heating system, you have to be your own project manager, your own expert on building physics. You have to juggle 3 or 4 different contractors. It should be simple as phoning somebody up and saying, come and low carbon my home. They can work out what radiators you need, what windows you need, how it would work with a heat pump, etc., etc. And we do spend too much time thinking about the technologies which are coming in, which are providing the heat. We have to think about how the package works, how the system works. So that's about providing places where companies can try new things, where they can try different offers. You can give people better control, harness the potential of digital technology, which I'll talk about a bit, but could be completely transformative in this sector. I'm not talking about smart meters, I'm talking about room by room control, a better experience for those of people who've enjoyed it, allows people to understand where they're wasting energy, and also make it much more relaxed about moving to a new system if they had a better control and experience. So think about the consumer is one big part of it. The second part, which is kind of being hinted on, but I just want to really underline it, is heating is much more than electricity decarbonisation, a local problem. The needs of decarbonising the heating system of Cornwall are very, very different from Farrow or from Glasgow or from Norfolk or wherever. You really need to understand the state of the building stock, the potential for district heat, all of those kind of things. And there's a kind of missing part of of a kind of energy institutional arrangement, which means that we've got all the local authorities kind of signing up to climate change agreements, ambitious climate change targets, but no real way of turning those ideas and those aspirations into real plans and real projects which are actually going to help people. And that means that we're going to, if we're not careful, we'll do it in a kind of half-hearted. We'll try things in different areas, and we won't really understand local conditions. So, thinking about how you can build those transition plans locally is something that government really needs to get serious about, as the Committee on Climate Change pushed recently. And also, go for it on net zero in a few places. Really see, are there 3 or 4 places in the country where we could get to net zero by 2030, 2035? A real galvanizing, inspiring project for particular parts of the country. I'll just finish with one quick point on energy efficiency, because I think one of the questions that Alex raised at the start was why has it failed? Well, just we have to be a bit careful on that, because it the energy demand and the average kind of energy demand in houses has fallen, and that's been a mixture of the fact that we all have light bulbs which use a kind of tenth of the energy, but it's also because of the rollout of loft and cavity wall insulation, all that kind of deeply unsexy technology which has helped, as well as kind of improved product standards. But the truth is, we don't know how effective it has been, and considering the amount of money we've spent on it, that's a huge scandal, really. But there is, again, and I said I come back to it, the promise of digital technology to actually understand whether improvements you make to your home actually make a difference to your bills. Because there's always the suspicion that with all the kind of big schemes, there's a risk with Green Homes Grant, we're going to get lots of people rapidly trying to roll out insulation in different homes, etc. But now we have the technology, relatively low cost sensors, where you should be able to see in the kind of energy profile of your house quite cheaply whether these measures are working, and that will build up the standards of performance of installation and heating measures, and then it also allows finance to come in the back, because it actually believes that this thing is desirable and has the consumer backing, and then you can kind of get the scale we need to meet that huge challenge I set out at the start.
Fantastic, Guy. Cheaper, greener and better, and you've covered off skills and the local problems and issues with demand, and of course the fact that if it translates to cheaper bills, then obviously that does have a bit of an impact on the enthusiasm for uptake of some of these changes. We've now got we're now free to open up to the questions, which are coming in thick and fast. I'm advised that some of the Q&A function may not be displaying properly, but the Bright Blue team are still receiving your questions nevertheless, so please do continue to send them through. There are so many coming through that I'll just go straight to the audience questions. So Hugh Baker has asked, how much potential is there for a decentralised energy grid with energy efficient households selling their surplus energy back to the grid? And I'll take another one at the same time if that works. How can the government encourage people to embrace low carbon heating? £2,000 for a gas boiler and £12,000 plus for I'm afraid I don't know the acronym, an ASHP with larger radiators. I think people can't afford this. So anyone like to come back on that, and perhaps someone could just clarify the ASHP as well for me.
It's an air source heat pump.
Excellent. I could have got that one.
Well, what I'm doing, I'm going to leave the decentralisation of energy hubs and selling back a distributed generation to others. So one of the consumer aspects, and Guy kind of mentioned this, and Bob as well, you're asking consumers to navigate a hugely complex set of understandings of their own property, what their energy portfolio should look like, and what the best technical interventions into those homes might be. So kind of there needs to be a huge amount of, it needs to be hugely more simple in order for this to be scalable, but also for us to be able to understand the sorts of consumer protections that are required and the sorts of measures of payback that you might get to it. And quite frankly, we're just not there yet. We have too fragmented a supply chain. We don't have the stuff that the Catapult has been championing quite properly, which is heat as a service. You know, you pay for your heat rather than you pay for all the individuated, aggregated elements that might deliver it. So there's a lot to be done in order for this to be a really simple consumer proposition that people might be able to get behind and be able to compare, as opposed to, you know, the cost and the benefits of getting an electric vehicle, for instance. What I would say is that for 4 million fuel poor households, it's really not even about how you're going to, what's the best investment in your capital asset that you could make. I have to go back to this, and only government, sadly, the scale of this infrastructure challenge around energy efficiency means there's only one agency, only one institution is able to drive it properly, and that's going to be government. And how it does it with all the demands on the exchequer or something, but we're going to need to find a grant program as well, a government intervention program, which makes sense, which targets the most vulnerable, and you can have some assurance on the quality of the outcome for households.
Thanks, Adam. Did anyone want to follow up on that or make a comment on this selling back to the grid? I mean, does that incentivize people if they think they can sell back some of the energy that they're generating or saving?
Well, if I can just comment, I think one of the aspects here is that we always have to remember that a certain amount of electricity is always being used, throughout 24 hours a day, and so therefore there's the grid relies on a certain amount of proportionment across the nation, and equally we know that there are severe peaks. You know, classically during major sporting events at half time, or when then suddenly there'll be a peak in electricity usage as everyone goes out to make a cup of tea or coffee, and so on, and you get these peaks as well. So it is possible for this to be achieved, but it's going to be, I think, quite difficult to just rely on a local arrangement. That's one of the reasons why we have the sophisticated national grid system that we do have.
Lovely. And then another question that's coming through here is it actually realistic to decarbonise heat without a significant increase in costs? The alternative heat sources mentioned cost much more than natural gas. And perhaps we can also dovetail that with a bit of a question around fairness. I mean, there are certain costs to installing some of these. Obviously, there are payments and fees that people can afford to. Does people have a view on that side of things?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that, Alex. So people are, at the moment, the way we're looking at it, the low carbon heating system is going to be more expensive than the current system. It's worth, of course, pointing out that the current system doesn't actually pay the cost of its environmental pollution at the moment, which is even if it did, it would likely be cheaper. But if you had if you switched from a gas boiler to a heat pump, your kind of annual running costs, because a heat pump is much more efficient than a gas boiler, are going to be roughly the same. The problem is the big challenge is, as well as making sure that works properly, which is not nothing, but the running cost should be roughly the same. Your big challenge is as one of the previous questions pointed out, your capital cost of that heat pump versus the very mature supply chain of boilers at this stage. And that is where the government, at least initially, is going to have to work to reduce the differential between those and to help people out. And that could be a combination of long-term financing, could be a combination of grants, which we seem to be going in the direction of green home grants, which I think is right. But it should also be about pushing the cost of that technology down. The lessons of the renewables kind of success over recent years is if there is scale, then people in the industry will work out a way to get it down, whatever we've seen it fall on offshore wind, from £140 a megawatt hour to £40 a megawatt hour in kind of 7-8 years. Now, there's been subsidy along the way to get there. The combination of competition and pushing downward pressure on it has done that. And heat pumps is a relatively immature industry in the UK. And it won't become more mature unless there's actually a scale to do, and that's all about incentives playing out.
And it's also worth saying that the fairness agenda is about who pays, when they pay, and how they pay. We've had a history of lots of infrastructure developments in the energy sector where you've recovered the cost of that through a flat rate levy on the consumer bill, which is a regressive way of doing it. So we need to understand where those costs fall, how they fall fairly, and over what period they fall. So it's a complex mix of how you require changes in homes through regulation, whether that's the design of new builds or regulation for private landlords or others to be able to make sure their homes fit with a trajectory towards kind of net zero, incentivizing green finance packages for people who want to do it but want a payback ratio that makes sense, but also recognizing that at the moment, if we were to do this through, as we tend to do a lot of stuff, through levies on the energy bills, that hits everybody in the same way. It's regressive, it hits the poorer most, and it's not a fair or really a sustainable way of doing it. And at the moment, there's a real challenge in saying, well, the government must step forward and government must lead that. We need central government funding with all the pressures on the exchequer. But there are certain infrastructure challenges which are of such a scale, especially during a certain time frame, where you can't get away from what the institution is that's going to be able to lead a lot of that. And unfortunately, that's one of the challenges for the government and successive governments in the context of net zero, in the context of fairness, is what is the leadership, what is the strategy from government to drive those changes across the millions of households that need to be affected.
Now, one of the, I was just going to add to that. I mean, the issue about the difference in price between the capital investment required for example, installing a heat pump or putting a new boiler in is really significant. And one of the reasons why we've failed so far is because schemes like the RHI haven't supported that in any way. They've expected people to pay the upfront cost, and of course, only a relatively small minority of people can afford to do that. The more recent schemes that have been announced go some way towards addressing that, but they only go some way, and the price of a boiler is still going to be something like half the cost that you would still have to find to install a heat pump. And this sort of thing is a major cause of friction. Really, people don't want to pay more than they have to, and Guy is absolutely right when he says that the experience that people need to get from their heating system is going to have to be substantially better to encourage people to make that kind of investment. I mean, back in the 1970s, it was much easier to sell a central heating system because it was so much better than what people had before. Now that isn't the case, and it's a much tougher challenge. But one way you can address it is not by replacing the boiler, but by changing the fuel. And certainly for off-grid homes that use oil at the moment, there is the potential of switching to biofuel. And this is not an entirely straightforward task. There is a challenge around securing enough of that fuel and supplying it at a price that means that people don't have to pay much more for it than they are at the moment. But the potential certainly is there, and our industry thinks that this is a much better way forward than replacing the appliance. And certainly the fuels that we're looking at the moment, you would not have to make very much in the way of changes to your system. You can use the same tank, you can use the same boiler with relatively few adaptations, and you can go straight away and make a massive difference to your carbon emissions.
Excellent. Thank you for your responses on those questions. The questions are coming in faster than we're going to get through them, so I'm going to do them in groups, and I'll leave you to take your pick as to which particular one you would like to respond to, but perhaps we can get a decent coverage. So just on the finance point, Marco Paris has mentioned, given the pressure on public finances, are loans rather than grants the answer to financing retrofitting? Another question, which reflects more perhaps on the new homes rather than the retrofitting, is David Dundas is saying, important to improve existing homes by 2050, and house energy must be green electricity powering heat pumps. Surely the best way to start is by installing heat pumps in new homes. And then a third one that we can pick up, a little bit different, but we've got Duncan Small saying, does the panel fear the reformation of planning regulations will not address low carbon heating and energy efficiency measures? So we've got sort of a comment there on sort of heat pumps and the future, and also on the planning side, and then also the finances, whether it's loans versus grants. Would anyone like to throw their hat in for any of those questions?
Well, I'll kick off if no one else is willing. I think the first thing we have to do in terms of the planning rules is actually insist that heat pumps or the equivalent are utilised. There is appropriate energy efficiency in the homes that are built, and also in terms of the supply of energy. So that doesn't mean to say we water down the planning reforms. It does mean that the regulations that apply to new build housing, particularly new estates, because I think our other panelists may be able to comment on this better, but the reality is that the scale ability of providing heat pumps will mean that the price will come down as the manufacture of them is made cheaper and quicker, and also the knowledge that new homes are being built with these inbuilt. So there's a benefit to have that in place, and I think that's going to be key, because these are expensive items at the moment, and they will add to the cost of a property. I also think the equation that people will look at is if you acquire heat pumps or the equivalent, or other changes to your property, then the issue will be, okay, I can have a long-term loan, and how does that equate against the energy efficiency? So am I going to be paying less for my electricity? So I'm paying a loan, but actually my electricity costs have come down. And that would have to be reflected to make it an incentive for an individual to take up this particular option.
Thank you very much, Bob. Any other comments on the questions that were raised, or we can open some more?
If you just to reiterate the point that Bob made about scale, right? As I say, it's heat pumps is a tiny kind of almost cottage industry in the UK right now compared to continental Europe, where there are millions going on. And so, guess what? It costs more. We don't have the experience with installing. It's not necessarily the tech. It's actually the people putting in and not as familiar. So, there's significant potential to bring down the cost there, and absolutely in kind of new build homes, we shouldn't be building any homes that are having carbon footprint. It's a kind of, I think it was Emma who made the point. We've built 1 million homes since 2007, the Climate Change Act, which are going to need to be retrofitted. It's kind of significant mistake. So absolutely there are potential for doing it. And if you bring down the capital cost, then suddenly the loans that Marco mentioned at the start become more attractive, and you have a package where you can get to a sustainable industry, and that's what needs to happen.
It's also worth saying that the current Green Home Grants program, which I hugely welcome, is as much an economic stimulus package coming out of COVID as it is a long-term strategic engagement with the issue. So there's a reason why there's grants to get people working quickly and get them at scale. There's a huge amount we'll learn from it, but it probably won't be replicated in what hopefully will be the next iteration of it. Some of those vouchers in the Green Home Grants require a contribution from those people who are able to pay for those sort of things. So we've got different mechanisms. I would just say that the grants are vital for that large proportion who just cannot afford and will not be able to afford, no matter what the green incentive will be, the capital investment required to do it. And if we have to transform almost all of our homes, it's really important that we don't just leave a big rump at the end of those people who can least afford it and will suffer the most. But clearly, the idea that government is going to grant fund every home for this transformation is for the birds. One thing I would say about the heat pumps, I absolutely agree with Guy. There's a maturation of the market here, which is we are weirdly behind, strangely behind. One of the reasons we might be is because the energy efficiency of the fabric of our properties are not conducive for an easy installation of heat pumps. I'm not saying that you have to do the fabric of every property first, but for so many, it will be a precondition of being able to put good heat pump technology in and to get the responsiveness and the thermal benefit that we know people will expect as a bare minimum to be the same as they currently have through a gas central heating system.
Yeah, I can definitely agree there with what Aaron's saying. It's particularly true, unfortunately, of off-gas grid properties. Only 3% of all heated homes are in EPC bands A to C, the vast majority of them are very energy inefficient, mainly due to the fabric of the building. So poor insulation and solid walls being a primary problem. I mean, 765,000 oil heated homes are in the worst performing bands of E to G. And BEIS said this just in the last week that it will cost something like £18,000 to, on average, to retrofit those homes to get them up to band C. So when you consider those costs, you're not including the additional costs of upgrading to an air source heat pump, for example, you've got a lot of money that would need to be spent. And these are the households that have the least disposable income, because typically they'll be paying more for their heating. So you've got a double whammy there. And I think without finding more cost-effective solutions for these households, they are not going to take action on their own.
Actually, just picking up on that point, Malcolm, Richard Seaborn here has asked, roughly 17% of British houses are social houses, housing lower income members of society. Is this a target area for government support for low carbon heating? And I would add to that, I understand from some of the housing associations that during COVID, access to properties for the purposes of gas boiler inspections was actually a real problem from a property management side. Do you think that, I mean, answering Richard's question there, is it a target area for government support? And do you think that there could be some property management and operational efficiencies here that are not really being advertised as a plus point to this sort of aspect of the agenda?
If I could say, it is a target, but it's also one of the sectors that has done the most. We've had some astonishing activity from social landlords and housing associations, not everywhere, but across the piece. It's been one of the success stories, especially for the lowest income. But part of the government's manifesto, the Conservative manifesto promises, was for a social housing decarbonisation kind of fund to come out, and we were hoping that was going to be in the budget and the comprehensive spending review. But there's more that needs to be done there. But it's an area of actually quite significant achievement already. I think access, because lots of boiler repairs and new boilers were part of the allowed under the COVID restrictions. So that's been possible, but of course it's been affected by it. But you have to remember that the reason why COVID supercharges this as an issue, and we could easily forget about it very quickly. It may seem impossible to think that we would forget about the lessons of COVID, but it's probably going to happen in a year or two, is that there are people who are using more, paying more and owing more at the same time that they're earning less, moving about to other warm places less. And the risk that, even though that's typically true for lots of people on low incomes, so many people are going to be using way too little over the winter. So I just want to reinforce that we don't lose the lessons of COVID once we all have finally the chance to breathe the biggest sigh of relief in our living memories and hope we can move on to business as usual.
Super. I'm going to keep going with the questions, if I may. So actually, I just wanted to pick up on something that Emma mentioned when she was speaking around the quality of retrofitting and the potential issue or challenge of a rust job set by this March 2021 deadline. And to elaborate a little bit further, I think there's a trust aspect to this around the consumer taking on some of these changes, and we've heard some stories about some retrofitting that's really not being done in the right way. How much do you think there's an educational information piece for the public that isn't getting conveyed at the moment? Because this can be quite a complex agenda for people to grapple with. Is that a barrier to undertaking some of this?
Well, I've got a good point I can make here. One of the things that relates to this is, I mean, if you think about schemes like the Green Deal, and I mean, actually the government's done a good job, I think, in encouraging higher standards through Trustmark and things like that, which means that, you know, the technician doing the job should be, you know, very competent and capable. But one of the problems with these schemes is that it's very difficult for small installers to get involved. So local businesses that depend on their local reputations are often frozen out, and it's bigger organisations that deliver schemes like ECO and other grant-funded work And one of the downsides of that is that they tend to subcontract out the actual installs on a rate for each installation done, and that tends to encourage installers to do as many installations as quickly as possible, because that's how they get paid. The disadvantage of that, of course, is that they aren't necessarily going to be quite so careful about the quality of the work they do, and they're not likely to see that customer again either. So it doesn't really help for high standards. And I think one of the key learning points here is that for future schemes need to be designed in a way that encourage local installers to get involved and deliver that work, because I think that's the best surety really of a good job, because they'll know then they've got a long-term customer.
Yeah.
One thing I would also add is that you're talking about kind of education of consumers. But again, I just go back to the point that this is something that people don't really want to engage in. It's something they're going to do once every, 10 years or something. And so for them to be able to kind of go that in depth and get all that knowledge is not really feasible. So I think what they need is to know that they can trust what they are, what they're buying and the people that they're buying it from. So I think that needs to come from some kind of regulation, really, practically speaking.
I think that's so important. You make consumers do too much of the work in these sorts of young markets. So regulation and enforcement is absolutely key for the supply chain. I mean, one of the inevitable issues with the green home brands is its short-term nature. You'll get much better behavior from the supply chain if they can see themselves in a long-run, continuing marketplace where they have to meet certain kind of regulation and standards and expect to be doing it for a period of time. So it's partly about the growth of that market into a mature, responsible, well-regulated one.
And just to say, I think it is a important of regulation and standards. But if Sainsbury's, if I order an online Sainsbury's and it doesn't turn up, you phone up Sainsbury's and they know it's not here, right? They've got the evidence because they're digitally tracking it, right? We should be doing exactly the same with heating. We should be working out whether the loft insulation you've had installed is actually different. Because the difference between a well done loft insulation and a shoddy cowboy one is huge. You're talking about 20-30% on your on the difference in savings. And now we've got technology is starting to appear which can make that happen. So why should energy be in this kind of ancient analog world? And that allows you to have confidence, because you can actually go back and say, well, you didn't do it properly, come back and do it. And you can, you've actually got some evidence to do that, rather than kind of, what lots of people do. They get their loft and they think, has it made a difference? Am I much warmer? Not always the case.
Sorry, just to add, I think that's because people, again, don't fully understand what that should look like. They don't know that, if I put in double glazing, it should save me this amount and that kind of thing. So I think on that level, that amount of consumer education is important. And I don't think that messaging is getting through.
Some feedback for future activities, I think, there. But thank you very much to our panelists. I think we've got so many questions we haven't had time to get to. But thank you to our audience for sending those through. A big thank you to our panelists as well for such an engaging conversation, and to Offtech for partnering us with this event. And of course, if you'd like to know more about Bright Blue or become a member, please do sign up on the Bright Blue website. We've got 15 events this conference. The next one is in 30 minutes, Care After COVID, which is future financing in half an hour with the Right Honourable Damien Green MP. So we hopefully will see you there shortly. And again, a big thank you to our speakers, Bob, Malcolm, Emma, and Adam and Guy. Thanks very much for joining us.